very warm welcome to all the speakers, panelists, and guests who have flown in from all over the globe. The Future of Heritage Learning from the Aga Khan Historic Cities program is a seminar conceived and curated by Maria Aslam of ADA, Architecture Design Art, in collaboration with the Aga Khan Trust for Culture Education program. This seminar examines the challenges facing the built heritage of Pakistan, specifically Karachi's inner city, in the light of the methodology and approach to heritage conservation and adaptive reuse projects of the Aga Khan Historic Cities program. Maria Aslam established ADA magazine in 2008 along with her practice of architecture and interior design artworks. In her multifaceted career, she has worked in design, led the research, and has been nominated as a speaker, convener, juror, and critic in various global events. A graduate at the Indus Valley School of Art and Architecture with a master's degree from McGill University, she has represented Pakistan in many global forums. She has held prestigious leading positions for various architectural organizations in Pakistan and is currently the chairperson of Pakistan Institute of Interior Designers. She is a prolific writer, architectural historian, and an environmental activist. Maria has also conceived and conceptualized the ADA Awards for the creative community in the disciplines of architecture, design, and art. I now request Maria Aslam to officially inaugurate and introduce the proceedings of this seminar.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome and a very good morning to all of you. We have amongst us the luminaries. We have Shiraz Ali Bhai, Yudhishthir Raj Isar from AKTC. Arif Hassan Saab has joined us. Thank you, sir. Masood Khan, Hafiz, Kalimullah Lashari, Yasmin Chima, Samar Ali Khan, Dr. Gulzar Haider, and my fellow friends and colleagues. Welcome again. It is truly an honor being here today with such an august audience, and I start the day's proceedings with a quote. A city is a combination of many things: memory, desires, signs of a language. It is a place of exchange, as any textbook of economic history will tell you, and these exchanges are not trade in goods. They also involve words, desires, and memories, quote unquote, Calvino's invisible cities. The lingering traces of fragments of the past that intertwine the present-day lives with architecture as its receptacle, photography as captured moments, letters, postcards, maps, and other paraphernalia that we human amass as accoutrements in life to seize the present for the future. Hence, heritage, be it tangible or intangible, is a significant essence of each individual since it comprises of our very personal belongings, and memories. Similarly, heritage buildings are collectively important for a multitude of reasons, ranging from historicity, politics, typology, and architecture. It is not in my purview to discuss this vast subject of heritage and adaptive reuse, which will run its discourse in the day's proceedings. I will take this opportunity to talk about the city of Karachi. Karachi is a pulsating, throbbing, and vibrant city. The city has multitude of layers, none of which can be undermined, be it social, cultural, financial, and of course, artistic. Similarly, in the case of architecture, the city and landscape emerge as contested surfaces caught between the intangible layers of social stratification. The more I study this city, the more I'm lost with it, and the more it frustrates me. But it still dazzles me, and I would request all of you to be dazzled by Karachi once again. Whatever our individual take is from today's irreducible price of learning, I hope, apart from inspiring and motivating us intellectually, the proceedings and discourse will condition us to empathize with the city, our city. Talking about heritage, conservation, and adaptive reuse, we cannot defend gentrification that has insidiously crept in nor mitigate the social marginalization that some of the structures herald with their omnipotent presence, fueled by social and political agendas. The social dissent that erupts as a result is to be understood, because it is the masses that make the city. They are just like you and I. They are the end users. They are not the byproduct of the city. The city becomes the byproduct of the masses and its inhabitants. It reflects us, not the other way around. With this thought, I would leave you, and I hope you enjoy the proceedings. Thank you.
Professor Yudhishthir Rajasar straddles different domains of cultural theory, policy, and practice. Since January 2017, he has been the Education Director at the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. Mr. Isar has been involved with academia, is a prolific writer, and has led and conducted research with eminent organizations such as the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University, Australia, and an adjunct professor there from 2014 to 16. Mr. Isar was the founding co-editor of the Cultures in Globalization series and has authored many books, chapters, and articles in scholarly journals. From 1986 to 87, he served as the first executive director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at Harvard University and MIT. May I now request Mr. Raj Isar to introduce the Aga Khan Trust for Culture Education Program, please.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and very pleased to see so many of you here with us this morning. My first duty is to thank Maria Aslam and her team at ADA Pakistan, to thank our sister organization in the Aga Khan Development Network, the Aga Khan University, and salute the presence of the Provost, Dr. Carl Amrine, and the Vice Provost and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, now in the making, Dr. Anjum Halai. To thank all of you for being here in such impressive numbers, whether you are architects, conservation architects, independent experts, or faculty from architecture schools all over Pakistan, or last but certainly not least, as students from AKU and beyond who have had the good idea to join us here this morning, because after all, students are the central focus of any education program worth its name. This education program of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture was launched in 2017 at the behest of His Highness the Aga Khan in order to share with young people the knowledges and learnings accumulated by two of the Trust's flagship programs, the Aga Khan Award for Architecture and the Aga Khan Historic Cities Program. The central responsibility of the education program, therefore, is to promote within teaching and learning institutions, so that's essentially schools of architecture, but it's also at the secondary school level, to promote within these institutions the elaboration and delivery of modules, course components, teaching units that make use of this rich storehouse of knowledge. But this responsibility must also involve more than simply the utilitarian transmission of knowledge. The goal would be also and equally to bring about broader and deeper awareness among young people of the philosophy, values, principles, methods that underpin the work of these two flagship programs, because each in its own way is exemplary. In the case of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, the reflections and decisions made by successive generations of technical reviewers, and some of you have been technical reviewers or in this audience, and master jury members, the same thing. These generations of technical reviewers and master jury members over 14 cycles of the award, their thinking constitutes what's really a kind of a compendium, a kind of an encyclopedia of ways of thinking about, of evaluating, of valuing contemporary architecture across not just the Muslim world, but across the global South, and in fact across the whole world. as the award has clearly expanded to become. And in the case of the Historic Cities program, the many projects designed to preserve and revitalize historic city centers are being carried out with and for the communities of people who live in those spaces. And this approach offers many lessons in an approach to integrated urban rehabilitation that is as much about people as it is about bricks and mortar. And so, what is going to happen in this session this morning is that Shiraz Alibhai, the Deputy Director of the Trust, will introduce to you some of the key concepts that underpin the efforts of the Aga Khan Historic Cities program as a jumping off point, as it were, for 3 or 4 distinguished conservation experts in Pakistan who have been closely associated with the work of the program and can tell you in concrete terms what it has involved. But before these speakers take the floor successively, what I need to do is to just tell you a little bit more about what the education program has done to date and the sorts of ways in which it has fostered or supported the organization of courses and modules that actually draw upon the lessons that students of architecture and conservation can learn from the 2 programs that I've already mentioned. So what has happened is that already a series of courses, lectures, modules, together with 2 massive online open courses, 2 MOOCs, have already been developed or are underway in Bangladesh, Dubai, Egypt, India, Jordan, Malaysia, the Netherlands, Portugal, Sharjah, Tunisia, and the UK. And just to cite a few examples, in autumn of 2018, a workshop on community architecture was organized as part of the 4th year design studio of students at the Rizvi College of Architecture in Mumbai. And the college took their students to Indore, the city of Indore, to examine 2 Aga Khan awarded projects, one of which was Balkrishna Doshi's Aranya Community Housing Project, to look to re-explore the criteria, the reasoning of the architects, and look at the state of those 2 projects today, 30 and 40 years afterwards. Another example is a course that has been designed in Dhaka by the Bengal Institute for Architecture, Landscapes and Settlements that was given a year ago to focus on the awarded projects that are in Bangladesh and what lessons those projects can hold out for students there. And this course is being given again this year. Another example that has taken place, and I go across the world of Portugal, is a winter school on the challenges of urban conservation in a part of the city of Lisbon that is called Muraria, which actually means the Moorish town. And in this section of the city, you find the largest concentration of Bangladeshis in Europe, together with people from many other parts of the world. It's an immigrant neighborhood, but it's full of historic buildings. And so what the course did was to use as a kind of template, a jumping off point, the experience of the Aga Khan Historic Cities program, and look at that experience critically, not slavishly as a recipe of how to do it here, but what can we learn from AKHCP and what do we need to do quite differently. 2 forthcoming projects are 2 courses that are going to be developed at the Arab Academy for Science, Technology and Maritime Transport, that is actually also an architecture school in the architecture department, that will, and both courses, 1 course for undergraduates, 1 course in their graduate program, will equally draw upon the experience of the Aga Khan Historic Cities program, both in Cairo as well as in Delhi, in Kabul, and in Lahore. Another example is a winter school that is going to be conducted at Nile University in Cairo that will also be inspired by the work of the AKHCP. There will be an undergraduate course that will be designed that faculty will take part in at the end of the winter school, and there'll also be a course in the lifelong learning program. Now, we would very much like to see similar projects emerge in Pakistan, and in many ways this event is overdue. We would very much have liked to have held it much earlier, but I'm very happy that at last we are holding it. And this Future of Heritage seminar that we are attending today really marks the beginning of this process, and I believe that it will set the stage very well for everything that is designed to emerge from it. And so let the serious business begin now, and I will hand over the floor to the speakers who can really share the concrete experience and the ideas with you. Thank you very much.
We now start our first session, the Aga Khan Historic Cities program. The session will be started with Mr. Ali Shiraz Bhai's Culture and Identity, Memory and Rupture. Mr. Shiraz Ali Bhai is the Managing Director of ArchNet and Deputy Director of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture in Geneva, Switzerland. In this capacity, Mr. Shiraz coordinates the activities of the Trust across all of its programs and with other Aga Khan Development Network institutions and agencies. Mr. Shiraz is currently helping shape the strategy and direction of AKTC's portfolio of assets and working closely with the Trust's education program. He was trained as an architect at the University of Texas and at the Graduate School of Design, Howard University. Mr. Shiraz has been with the Trust since 1997, first as a Senior Documentation Officer with the award, then as Director of the Aga Khan Humanities Project. From 2002 to 2007, Mr. Shiraz is based at MIT to establish and manage the online global resource ArchNet, which continues under his direction. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Shiraz Ali Bhai.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about today is not the projects of the Historic Cities program. What I'd like to talk to you about is not about the what, but the why. Why do we do what we do? And why is it important? And that'll set the stage then for my colleagues, Saif al-Rashidi and Masood, to explain the projects more in detail. I want to start with first what we're talking about. We're talking about culture and identity when we're talking about conservation and heritage. And what do we mean by culture? It's a very, very broad term. But we are talking about the different beliefs, the rituals, the customs, the knowledges, the languages, the laws of different human societies and groups that have developed over time through a combination of human thought and development. We could also be referring to the arts and heritage of different societies, and this includes value systems, traditions, and also beliefs. Culture is responsible for how we came to be. It's a very large part of who we are, and it influences who we will become. The title of this presentation is Culture, Identity, Memory, and Rupture, because they're all intertwined. Identity is a shifting concept of self. It's how you see yourself, how you insert yourself into the world. It's an important contributor to people's well-being. It provides a feeling of belonging to something much larger than yourself and offers a sense of comfort and security. It also provides people access to social networks, which offer support and shared values. What happens, however, when you're ripped from not only your identity, but from your cultural underpinning? Let's talk about going back to the 15th century when the first slave ships reached Africa. The first slave ship that went from Africa to America was 1619. And these slaves, or the Africans that were taken, were not fleeing religious persecution. They were not intent on finding a better life. They were not seeking a haven in economic or political systems in America, and they did not go in their own volition or will. They had been captured and torn from their homeland. The passage to America took 68 days. They were treated as cargo and not humans, ripped from their language, ripped from their traditions, ripped from their families, ripped from their value systems, ripped from their rituals in the day-to-day life. Hundreds of thousands of Africans died during the transport to America. Today, African Americans are still suffering from this legacy, and America is still suffering from their original sin. This tearing of culture and this tearing and shredding of identity is a theme that we keep coming back to, and we're seeing it today in the Muslim world, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. The Indian reservation system established tracts of land for Native Americans to live on as settlers took over their land. The main goal was to bring Native Americans under US government control and to change their way of life. Native Americans were forced onto reservations with catastrophic results and devastating long-lasting effects. Native Americans are place-based people. Their cultures are reflective of their relationship to the land and their continuity to it, and their environment shape their sense of identity. Infant mortality rates, alcoholism, poverty, illiteracy, and suicide rates are higher for Native Americans than any other ethnic group in the United States right now. As America grew into a status of a superpower, the first Americans were reduced to hopelessness. The National Museum in Brazil, as most museums do, preserved the country's heritage. In early September 2018, some of you may recall this, a fire tore through the museum and hundreds of thousands of objects representing 90% of the museum's collection were lost. The museum preserved documentation of indigenous languages for which there are no longer any living speakers. This documentation, now lost, took with it a culture, a civilization, a story of a life, and a chapter of our common humanity. I believe we're in a period right now of history in the Muslim world of great rupture. Rupture in our connection to our history and with our cultural identity. Rupture in our understanding of our place in the world and how we fit in the world. And rupture in our understanding of beauty and its sense, its connection to the divine. Without grounding in our sense of identity and engagement with our historical memory, a void is left. And this open wound in our psyche can fester and become infected. Belonging to a community represents our shared history and our identity. It's our bond to the past, to our present, and to the future. Social cohesion is the willingness of members of society to cooperate with each other in order to survive and to prosper. Without a sense of belonging and without a sense of common identity, social cohesion gradually dissolves, and human groups lose their necessary point of reference to relate with each other and with other groups. We live in a time where the contact between different peoples, cultures, and religions has never been greater than any period in human history. However, the promise of digital technologies bringing the world closer together has not been realized, and the world today is getting much more polarized. We've seen now that the more we get to know each other, the less we like each other. Muslim societies are facing a number of serious challenges. They're experiencing dramatic processes of transition and change, which are radically altering value systems for future generations. We are subject to the homogenizing forces of popular culture, which are coming from external sources, and they're seen as threatening the contributions Muslim civilizations have made to our common heritage. and symbols of pride and identity are disappearing, leading to a sense of exclusion and alienation. What's our response been? We are so busy trying to debate whether music is permissible. We are debating what is haram and what is halal, and the bigger problems of our society are just going to the wayside. This is, a cartoon. Some of you remember Mimar magazine from the 80s. This is a cartoon that appeared in Mimar magazine, and this was happening. This is what was happening in the architectural world in the 80s. We were kind of inundated with Western influences, and we didn't know how to respond with our own traditions, so we kind of stuck what we thought was appropriate to buildings, and I think that some of that is still going on today. Muslim societies are also struggling with population growth and poverty and environmental degradation, all of which are leading to a sense of disconnection. And as a result, Muslim societies are also questioning their place and their insertion into a rapidly changing world. Our past is disappearing, and with it our connection to our stories and to our history. By restoring heritage sites and engaging with the past, we begin to understand our history, connect with it, and use that knowledge to shape our aspirations. These sites are embedded with stories helping bridge cultures and shared values. If neglected, this vacuum can be filled by myth, by legend, by lies that become, by virtue of no other voice, the truth. You'll know what I'm talking about because these sites are physical links to our past. It's not just about saving bricks and mortar, but it's about saving the layers of knowledge that would otherwise disappear, thereby allowing our history to be written by others. Over the course of kind of the 20th century, the contributions of Africa were completely negated. We didn't talk about Africa in any positive ways. We always talked about it in a very degrading manner. I'll give you another example of the mental map of the world disappearing. When I was in architecture school, we studied a broad range of history of architecture, and we started with Mesopotamia, went to the Egyptians, went to the Greeks, went to the Romans, and somehow from the Romans we jumped straight into the Renaissance in Europe. The only single time we covered what I consider to be the greatest contributions of the arts from the Muslim world, it's architecture. We covered the Taj Mahal perhaps in 2 slides, and that was it. And that was the whole balance of the survey of history of architecture. And I don't know if it's changed very much. So who is shaping the narrative that describes our contributions as Muslims to world heritage? Who's writing our history? I'll give you another example. I was on the plane yesterday and I was reading the New York Times, and there was an article about a writer from Serbia who won the Nobel Prize last week. Well, the article went on to describe this writer as a genocide apologist. He had backed the 2 generals in the Serbian war. He had claimed that Muslims had bombed themselves to gain sympathy. He had denied that Srebrenica ever occurred, and he won the Nobel Prize last week. These are the people that are writing Muslim history right now. Where are our writers from the Muslim world? Where are our artists, our philosophers? Why are we always looking 600 years to the past to say, oh, we were great once, we did this then? How do we connect this to the aspirations of what the youth of today are looking for? So heritage sites can piece the narrative of who we are, where we come from, where we belong, and ultimately where we might go as nations, as communities, and as people. Our connection to heritage sites is not just intellectual. It can be emotional, and it can also be spiritual. What is the significance, however, of this historical memory for the Ummah in the contemporary world with its many problems? How can we look back to reinvigorate aspects of it and what level of significance should we accord to it. Since there's a general feeling, I think, that something has been lost, and it's critical to look back in order to look forward. What we call heritage is the physical artifacts and intangible forms of expression, knowledge and know-how that each generation inherits from past generations, passed on. Tangible forms include buildings, monuments, landscapes, books, works of art, and artifacts, and intangible forms is equivalent to music, traditions, oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, and rituals. Heritage sites are a record of history. They provide a timeline for human thought and development. They also allow us to understand the customs, traditions, and social structure, helping us progress towards a more ideal society. Culture, however, is more than just a set of objects and traditions. It's a result of a process of memory that selects, for both political and cultural reasons, what is worthy of being preserved for future generations and what is not. This is the Haram al-Sharif in Mecca. This was a picture taken in the 1920s. This is today. The history of the holy city has been completely wiped out with the Big Ben. They're planning a 10,000-room hotel next to the sanctuary with a helipad and all the other trappings of whatever we want in this consumer-oriented society. Often on the front lines of a community's affiliation and identity, heritage is being wiped out, targeted, and destroyed in order to erase the history and notions of identity and pluralism. Left to degrade, whether through neglect or the willful hand of man, heritage sites can become burdens, both financially and also in terms of memory. These great works from the past can be reminders that your life is actually worse than that of your ancestors. I walked through Cairo once with a guide, and he was showing me some of the really beautiful projects in the old city. And he was saddened by it because he said, look what they did in the past, look what they could do, and look at how far we've dropped. These sites were reminders to him, not of something great, but of failed dreams of his generation. And he felt that his children's lives would be worse off than his. So imagine going through your life knowing that your kids and your grandkids are going to be worse off than you. And that's a feeling I wouldn't characterize across the Muslim world, but certainly in many parts of it. By erasing these markers of identity and pluralism, a singular version of history is being imposed. And this understanding of a people and their narrative is also being wiped out.
My childhood memories, the ones that stick out most, would be playing around these really ancient monuments.
It's a legend, you know. You see pictures of the Grand Canyon. You see
terracotta. It was built by the first Chinese emperor, Qin Shi Huang.
There's something they call yodeln. I can't do that. It's just a funny voice they do. I don't know. I cannot do that.
There's something called the Char Minar in old city of Hyderabad, and
you have the sun here, which means light up the darkness. Light up the darkness, because in my country also we have a lot of things about like spirits.
Malambo. Guys do one thing and girls we do another thing. We dance in couples and girls we used to do like this and we dance in a way and another.
I have been there. Oh my God.
By that time it was the empires, the invaders who came and left and went, and Baalbek stayed.
The statue, just the same as the human being, the soldier, the horse, the chariot.
You're sitting there on the canyon and literally like your feet are dangling. You get all of these incredible colors on the canyon and bouncing off the canyon. there's nothing that can prepare you for that.
It's a structure that every Hyderabadi of every thread is proud to say that's a monument that symbolizes the city.
I don't know if you heard about Mami Wata, but you can look up. It's like a big god in the river that protects us and whatever.
All this, yani, it makes Baalbek not a Roman piece or a Greek piece or a Lebanese piece. It makes a place, a site where all the world is there.
قلعة حلب لما فتت علي أول مرة ففتنا على قاعة العرش اللي كان يقعد فيها صلاح الدين. إنه كنت عم ضل نق بالمعلمة تبعنا لأنه كنا رايحين مع مدرسة إنه بدي روح أقعد هونيك بدي روح أقعد هونيك وكذا. فهي ما تخليني. هربت وكنت راح أوصل إنه خلص شفت الحلم قدامي راح يتحقق إنه حفوت حقعد. فبيلقطني السكيورتي إنه
I couldn't accept it.
I can't imagine the United States of America without the Grand Canyon. The idea that that would not be there, I mean,
If they said no, there's no more that thing. I mean, it will be a shock. It will be sad.
It would be violence. I would feel violated.
I would think I'm in the wrong movie.
If we destroy the past, that means we will destroy the present and no future.
I can't imagine Lebanon without Baalbek. It exists. It will always be there, I hope.
إنه أنت تشوف تاريخك تشوف الأماكن الحلوة اللي كنت بتحبها اللي كنت تزورها اللي كنت عايش فيها كلها صارت ولا شيء ما عادت موجودة يعني هو صعب بس
The significance of the Aga Khan Trust for Cultures project in the contemporary world, beyond the approaches and methodologies that will be explained by my colleagues, is to revive historical memory. And by reviving historical memory, these projects seek to instill a sense of pride, strengthen identity, and improve quality of life. It's not simply about just preserving the past, however. These projects can advance positive change in terms of social development, local employment, entrepreneurial activity, cultural development where none existed before. Such projects can also have a positive impact well beyond conservation, as you can see by some of these numbers related to the environment. They also promote good governance, they strengthen civil society, they produce a tangible rise in incomes and economic opportunities, and they promote better stewardship of the environment.
All Muslims are called upon to improve the physical condition of our world. And honoring our cultural heritage is vital to that calling. Cultural heritage, of course, plays a central role in this endeavor. This focus was sharply intensified for me some 40 years ago, when I came to realize that the proud architectural heritage of the Islamic world was progressively vanishing. The physical legacy of great Muslim empires was collapsing, and the response in the Islamic world seemed to be oblivion. What was in fashion, what was prized and taught throughout the Islamic architectural world increasingly reflected Western preoccupations. Quality was viewed as Occidentalization. Our time-honored cultural heritage had been buried, obscured not only by the shifting sands of time, but also by an all-consuming Occidentalization. As one observer commented, the physical identity of the Islamic world had been reduced to coffee table books. It was out of these concerns that the Aga Khan Award for Architecture was established in 1977, followed by the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and its Historic Cities program. And as our agenda grew over time, and most excitingly, we also came to another critical understanding. We began to see the added potential of heritage projects for advancing an economic and a social agenda, for fighting poverty and driving development. To be sure, this potential was often ignored, as culture was too easily mislabeled as a luxury amid pressing social and economic needs.
In undertaking the work of the Historic Cities program, we're preserving an essential part of the patrimony of all humankind. Cultural heritage is a source of personal pride for many communities. It has the power to inspire, to give identity to, and to unify an entire nation. And it can also reveal that nation at its very best to the outside world. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the speakers.
Thank you, Mr. Alibhai, for that thought-provoking presentation. We now move on to our second presentation of this session, the AKTC Historic Cities Program in Pakistan, Framework for Conservations by Mr. Masood Khan. Mr. Masood Khan is an architect who has worked for nearly 2 decades in the conservation of cultural heritage. He was responsible in 1986 to 88 for the World Bank-sponsored study for the conservation of the World Study of Lahore in Pakistan, and since 1993 has been a senior consultant for the Historic Cities Support Program of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. In this capacity, he has been responsible for technical support and community development and cultural support programs, and for the conservation of a series of monuments, including Shigar Fort and the Ganesh Village Conservation Project. Mr. Masood Khan has also been active in architectural education and has taught at the National College of Arts in Lahore, at the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at Harvard and MIT, and as a Fulbright professor at the University of Engineering and Technology in Lahore. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Masood Khan.
Assalamu alaikum. I am honored to make this presentation of some 3 decades of the work of the Historic Cities program in Pakistan. So it began with Baltit Fort in 1990. It was finished in 1996. This was landmark project which started everything in Pakistan. And interestingly enough, from day one, the Historic Cities program was also concerned with the impact this landmark monument conservation project was going to have on the immediate surroundings, noteworthy for their scenic and natural landscape. And so the monument and its setting was even then considered extremely important. And fortunately, much of that landscape still survives. So here's just a list of the things that we did in Gilgit-Baltistan between 1996 and 2011. From the Baltit Fort, we went on to do this Karimabad Conceptual Development Plan, and then numerous projects, small and large, but marked by projects like the Shigar and Kaplu forts and the Altit Fort, and so on. The Ganesh Village Conservation and Social Development Project was an extremely important one, because that's when we were engaged. We found ourselves engaged in working at the micro level with the community, and the very, very intimate environment, physical and spatial environment and the social environment of this historic village. So I'm sure many of you have already been to Shigar, and Shehnaz's interiors much in evidence. That's Shigar Fort. And here is Kaplu Fort, where we did the first electronic documentation back in 2006 and 7. This thing can be called a framework for culture and development. And mainly it had to do with enhancing tourism and then dealing with all that tourism brings in its wake. And there are other external factors also impinging on what we tried to do, such as transport infrastructure, the Karakoram Highway in the northern areas, or in other places, large road projects. Then there are government presence and government policies, and there are macroeconomic factors, such as the fact that people have nowhere to invest hard-earned money hard-earned overseas, but in small shops in plazas when they come back looking for somewhere to invest. One of the things that marked our work was that landmark monuments and heritage sites were bequeathed into the public domain by their owners, and then they were conserved and recycled with support from the trust and from other donors. It was accompanied by a lot of work on clean water supply for the communities that lived around these monuments, sanitation, and other facilities. It was accompanied in many cases by the co-option of voluntary community participation, labor, and financial contribution, community financial contributions. And one of the important things was that in this process, we also moved towards the greater involvement of women in the workforce. Environmental and heritage values were therefore promoted as a matter of, almost unconscious result, because only when people see things happening in front of them can their identities and their sense of belonging get moved, and and environmental and heritage values are promoted. Again, another major factor was the use of tradition in organizing voluntary work by communities in the projects themselves and in the management of their civic affairs. Which brings us to Lahore. I'm just going to show you a few slides about Lahore, its monuments, mostly of the high and late Mughal period, tile work which came to a crescendo for over a century in the late 16th and the early 17th century, and then died out, passed out as quickly as it came. And monuments that were placed in gardens, and Lahore was known as a city of gardens, became known as a city of gardens. And many of these gardens were sepulchral gardens. They were gardens designed and built for people to be buried in. And not far from Lahore is this wonderful place called Sheikhupura, where there is a large water tank built in the memory of a pet deer by Jahangir. And then, of course, there's the Shalimar Garden. The walled city of Lahore, however, has a place of its own. This picture shows you how this city has been able to preserve its actual physical entity despite massive developmental pressures and growth all around it. And this is very rare because in many cases around the world, historic cities get penetrated and torn asunder by the forces of modern development. And here I try to show the walled city in its larger metropolitan context. Now, this is extremely important, and this is something that we've been grappling with. How does a small city, just a square mile in area, exist in a larger city, within a larger city that's now 11 million people? What kind of pressures and what kind of results of government policies or lack thereof impinge on the state of an urban heritage like this, and how can we mitigate the negative impacts of these larger developments? And how do we persuade our planners and our bureaucrats to think of every action they take at the scale of the larger metropolis, and how it would affect the heritage that we're trying to preserve? So, going back to Lahore in its Mughal era, the dotted line represents an approximation of the extent of Mughal Lahore, and the red dots are all the neighborhoods that were formed around gardens. So there were settlements and gardens all intertwined with each other, and many of these gardens have disappeared. Only a few remain, like the Shalimar or the Shadara complex. But we have remaining gateways and other residual architectural evidence to help map out where these gardens might be. The light green, the very light green, are the gardens that do not exist anymore. And the little dots are monuments, Mughal period monuments that are still strewn all over Lahore, some of them very hard to find. But within the walled city, you have the Lahore Fort, and the Lahore Fort itself is a conglomerate of gardens. And of course, the Kashikari tile work that emerged for 100 years before it was overtaken by a new round of architectural innovation in the time of Shah Jahan. So, and all this brings us closer to the ordinary heritage. This is still the large mansion of a Sikh potentate, or the son of a potentate, but we go on to the smaller, ordinary architecture in the walled city of Lahore, and we still have some 1,000-odd buildings like these that are quite regularly ignored, even when people go around looking for heritage. So in 2007, the Historic Cities program went into a partnership with the Punjab government, mainly to work on a World Bank pilot project for the rehabilitation of the walled city. This project involved urban services and infrastructure improvement, and urban and street facade rehabilitation, and some monument conservation. When we arrived, we had to start a whole new process of documentation and and creating baseline data for the city. We went through a process of strategizing how we can lay out our short and long-term interventions. We also actually designed and implemented the World Bank project. We helped create a legal framework for urban conservation, and we did monument conservation. In terms of documentation, we did a socioeconomic sample survey, which resulted in becoming a survey of the poverty that prevailed in the walled city. Then we did a massive 100% record of each and every building and the land it stood on in the walled city. And we created a GIS database which could be used for data retrieval and analysis. Maps like these show, for instance, this is all about alterations in buildings, and you see how a dynamic and constantly changing city the walled city of Lahore is. The topographical survey was very, very important for all the work that followed, because it was the first time that record was created of the Z value of the heights and elevations in the walled city, which is very useful for engineers. We carried out strategic planning in the beginning, and we laid out the basic principles under which we would work in the year 2008. And then we carried out a strategic 20-year design framework for integrated infrastructure development. The 2008 strategic plan aimed mainly at finding strategies which would allay and slow down the erosion of the city's original building stock, and it grappled with the nature of economic functions in the walled city, which are very, very problematic, and I can answer questions later about them. How do you tap heritage as a catalyst for overall rehabilitation and an improvement of life in the old city? And then working with the residential communities within the walled city to participate in and benefit from the area's new development. Advancing environmental upgrade proposals in coordination with central and greater Lahore areas. This is basically just a couple of slides showing the phasing of the integrated infrastructure design, which included 6 infrastructure elements. The important thing was they were designed integratedly so that they could be carried out in a single project in various phases of the historic city. This is the state of the existing infrastructure. Much of this has been removed. And this is just a couple of illustrations of the guidelines that were given as part of that integrated conceptual design. The World Bank pilot project was called the Shahi Guzargah project, and within it we did a little demonstration project which would inform the larger project. By the way, this project comprises about 11% of the city's area. And now that it's almost complete, we're beginning to launch actually another project which is about 1.5 times the size of this one. So the demonstration project also was a laboratory in terms of how we work with communities at a very detailed level. And, because work on a very important aspect was when you do facade improvement, it's not just for the beauty of it, but because of the peculiar physical qualities of the city, a lot of infrastructure had to be mounted on these facades. So the World Bank readily acquiesced to declaring the facades of building something that could be taken into the public realm. And so the public and the private became very deeply intertwined. We had to remove bathrooms that had been stuck onto the facades, and we had to go inside the homes and redesign bathrooms and integrate the bathrooms in the way the homes functioned, which brought the interaction with the communities to a very, very deep and fine-grained level. Then, of course, a lot of these facades were documented, alternate interventions in these facades were proposed. And then we took, as another demonstration aspect of the exercise, we took the conservation, the complete conservation of 13 historic homes. So these are some of the before-after pictures of what resulted from the effort. We worked with the government and were able to get the government to create a new act called the Walled City of Lahore Act of 2012, which is a very interesting document, and I would encourage you to, when you have the time, to Google it and particularly read the definitions of things like heritage, etc. Because I think it's the first time in Pakistan, or perhaps the history of South Asia, that the term heritage is defined in such all-encompassing terms. The Act required the preparation of a master conservation and redevelopment plan, which was completed in 2017. And as a result of that, a register of heritage properties were created, building bylaws and other regulatory instruments were created. And part of the exercise, as mandated in the law, was the identification of zones of special value within the walled city, mainly because if we did that, if we identified specific areas which were more highly valued than other areas, then we could direct our investments and our efforts more productively. A land use plan for the future of the walled city was devised based on the way the city used to function in the past. So a number of things that have happened in the walled city that are taken for granted were rather courageously slated to be done away with over the long term. But we still had to make recourse to something that you may be familiar with, which is when you declare things to, when you recognize the right of, the vested right of people when they've built a building and declare these buildings non-conforming. They can stay, but they will remain non-conforming until such time as certain conditions attached to that non-conforming use end, and the building can be turned into what we want it to be, the land to be used in the manner that we want it to be. So this is something that is still being, people are trying to understand it in the government, because something like this has not been attempted before. This is a map of the zones of special value, the first one of which is that, which is the Lahore Fort and the Bashahi Masjid complex. Then there are 6 other zones of special value, some of which are divided up into smaller pieces. Working on a zone of special value, we laid down certain ways in which the work could be done. And one of them was to try and gather enough information that you're able to define and understand the way the city is put together at a fine grain level. It also helps us in understanding architectural typologies where they exist. And it so happens in the walled city, you have differing architectural typologies from neighborhood to neighborhood. And you have actually a sense of living sense of how typologies are created and the moment in which certain typologies come into existence. Looking at facade typologies, for instance, we were able to try and understand the way traditional houses were constructed and whether we could glean some sense of the order that they contained. And understanding that order then enabled us to propose the manner in which houses could be modified and brought into consonance with the spirit of the architecture as it existed prior to being modified and so on. And also, it helped us to find ways in which we can design newer buildings as insertions in the urban fabric. As part of our work, we also look at civic open spaces within a zone of special value and try and see how it can be modified and greater order brought into them. We carried out 3 major monument conservation work so far. The first one is the Shahi Hammam Conservation Project. And Shiraz showed you a slide of this before. The monument existed at the street level. At the time the monument was built was some 8 feet below the present street level. So we had to construct a retaining wall, which is very useful in keeping the monument separated from the humdrum of daily life in the walled city. This is an interpretation room where we show videos and other, also used as a lecture room. The Masjid Wazir Khan, which is an ongoing project, but here we have changed the square, which was completely encroached upon, and cleared the encroachment and tried to retrieve a part of the square, taken down some 5 feet below the existing street level. Again, another view of the Wazir Khan Mosque. The northern facade, where again the shops that had been sunken and buried under the road have been recovered by building a retaining wall, and a part of the bazaar is taken down. And finally, the Lahore Fort, where you recall this is the zone of special value 1. And here what we've tried to do is to separate, make a proposal for the separation of the Lahore Fort from Shalimar Gardens as a single case of a World Heritage Site. And by separating them, we could propose that the Badshahi Masjid and the Huzuri Bagh and the Sikh monuments are contained within a new World Heritage Site. This proposal has been mooted to the World Heritage Committee, but I suppose major work has to be done in making the proposal. In 2018, we carried out a new master plan for the Lahore Fort, and in doing that, we made very interesting discoveries in terms of how problematic the description, the historical progression of construction in the wall fort is. For instance, this is called Jahangir's quadrangle, but it so happens that we discovered that the Akbari period Daulat Khana Khas Am extended. It's a massive structure, much of which does not exist anymore except for the foundations. And then, of course, the dalans on either side are so reminiscent of Fatehpur Sikri. Yet we know that Jahangir period interventions went on the northern side. So similarly, this is, for instance, Shah Jahan's quadrangle, which we found was parts of the Jahangir period construction that were massively modified during the Shah Jahan period. Again, the Shah Burj was a project which was created, which was launched by Jahangir, but which was overtaken by Shah Jahan when he built his own Shah Burj, and so on. The British plowed through and built this road, that road, which rises some 30 feet from that point to that point and tears through the remains of Mughal period palaces that used to exist here. And these palaces were in turn connected with the old historic royal kitchens. This is a very interesting unraveling of the history of the Lahore fort, which has appeared in this master plan. Again, this shows what has gone. For instance, these cells all around the great Maidan of the Diwan-e-Am do not exist anymore. There were attempts at reconstructing entire sections of the historic fabric that were removed during the British era. And this is, of course, not real reconstruction, but a restitution of sorts of how there was a wall here which enclosed this Hathi pole, which was sort of like a parking yard for elephants before they entered that gate and went up to the palace. Then, of course, some 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, we began working on the gigantic picture wall, which is an apron wall embellished with mosaic tiles and fresco, which is about 550 meters long and some 15 meters high. So the western part of this picture wall is now completely restored. These are scaffoldings during the time it was being conserved. So that's about it. I hope I have not gone over my time. But there'll be a lot of questions in my mind that I'd like to talk about further. So please feel welcome to ask me as many questions too. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Masood Khan, for taking us through your journey of the conservation projects. Move on to our next presentation, Making Historic Cities Work for Their Local Communities by Saif al-Rashidi. Mr. Saif will be joining us remotely from London, and while he gets connected, architectural historian and urban regeneration specialist Saif al-Rashidi is an Egyptian architectural historian and urban regeneration specialist. He is currently the director of the Barakat Trust and the project manager of the University of London's Layers of London project. Prior to this, he managed the year-long celebration of the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta at Salisbury Cathedral and was responsible for coordinating the public consultation on the cathedral's master plan. From 2008 to 2014, he worked for Durham University and Durham Cathedral, managing Durham's UNESCO World Heritage Site. From 1997 to 2008, he worked in Cairo for the Aga Khan Trust for Cultural's Historic City Program and for Ahmad Hamid Architects between 1995 to 1997 on a range of contemporary architecture and interior design projects. Mr. Saif al-Rashidi also is the co-author of The Tent Makers of Cairo, Egypt's Medieval and Modern Applique Craft. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now joined by Mr. Saif al-Rashidi.
Well, I'm assuming that I can start, and sorry I can't be here in person, but my presentation is focusing really on the Aga Khan Trust for Culture's work in Cairo in terms of involving the community in urban regeneration and seeing the community as being the heart of any scheme to improve an urban environment, and in this case, a historic urban environment, which is the southern half of historic Cairo. And just in 30 seconds, I'll just show you a couple of slides of Cairo for those of you who haven't seen it. Sorry, 1 second. So historic Cairo is an extremely dense urban environment. It has hundreds of medieval and post-medieval monuments, but it's a living city of people just living normal lives, lots of craftsmen, lots of small shops. And one of the key things about historic Cairo, which I think one of the big changes that the Aga Khan's vision did for historic Cairo was to put people at the center of schemes to upgrade it. Since the 19th century, Egypt has had a very long tradition of preserving monuments and restoring them. But the residents of the historic area were never an important part of any of these schemes. They were always seen as secondary, if sometimes they were seen as to the detriment of the historic, and being there to the detriment of the historic environment. And the Historic Cities program sought to change that, to see people as an asset and livelihoods as an asset, and to think, well, how can the historic environment work for them? In the center of this map, the little light blue section is historic Cairo. So Cairo is a huge city of 20 or so million people. The historic core is a small but very important part of it, with many monuments, as I said. It also has spiritual and religious significance, tourist significance, and like many historic urban environments of such a scale, there's a complexity of uses, of interests of people, and our aim was to bring all that together. And this is just a normal bread seller. I wanted to emphasize the fact that we didn't seek to create an open-air museum, but instead to make it a more functioning but better preserved city. This is a typical local festival. So the area that we focused on is Darb al-Ahmar, the southern half of historic Cairo, which is the poorer half. Unlike the more touristy area to the north, this one was mainly craft shops, workshops, because it's cheaper. On the eastern edge of this area was the city wall, or is the city wall, built in the 12th century. And outside the city wall was a huge dump site, which you can see here on the right, because for centuries, the residents of Cairo, that's where they disposed of their rubbish. And the whole vision of His Highness the Aga Khan and the Historic City Support Program was, how can we transform this rubbish dump into a public park in a city with very, very limited public space, almost no green space? And more importantly, how can we use this initiative to think about upgrading the area of Darb al-Ahmar for its residents and see how they can benefit from these initiatives in urban rehabilitation. And here's another view of this dump site outside the city wall, which we were then exposing because it had been almost completely buried in some cases. As you can imagine, living overlooking a dump site wasn't a very desirable thing. And when we did social surveys, we found that the poorest houses, the poorest people lived on the periphery of this walled city overlooking this unattractive dump site. Here is a traditional alley, which actually had some, I mean, the urban fabric, the buildings had value, but they were just in horrible condition. The area had declined over the course of 150 years from a middle class area to quite a poor area, especially alleys like this, which overlook this dump site, as I mentioned. One thing we found, however, was that there was a strong craft tradition of carpentry, shoemaking, and in thinking about how to revitalize Darb al-Ahmar, one of the key things we did was invest in improving the quality of local skills and things like carpentry, using them in our own work, in our own restoration projects, but as an opportunity to enable traditional craftsmen to ameliorate the level of their craft so that other people could use it. So they would have skills that were demanded in the market of the city of Cairo at large, rather than just producing very cheap and low-end items which would only cater to the poorest of the poor. And that was something that was key to what we did, the economic side of urban rehabilitation. Our vision and our thought process and our experience led us to realize that the cause of physical decline in historic cities is social and economic, and that if you don't address socioeconomic issues, I mean, you can preserve as many buildings as you want, but 20 years later, they'll be in as bad a condition as they were when you started. So that's why we focused on businesses and microfinance and business development and craft development as part of this project. And I think that's essential. There are also more specialized crafts like applique work, which I have subsequently studied. But the trouble with many crafts is that the local market doesn't really use them, and some of them are only of interest to tourists. And part of what we invested our time in was thinking, well, how can we make local crafts more relevant, especially crafts like handicrafts, which are not used for building and restoration. And that's important to linking craftsmen to new markets or helping them develop their products to appeal to different contexts. There were many low-end workshops, such as the shoemaker, and our business development program sought to improve the quality to make such enterprises more competitive and to compete not by producing the cheapest things, but by producing better things and more demanded things. Coming to the urban side of things, which was really at the heart of what we were doing, our approach was a participatory one. And in this image, you see segment of the local community clustered around the model of a neighborhood square, Aslam Square, which has a 14th century mosque, a dye shop, a cafe, various groceries. It's a neighborhood hub. And one of the things we thought, well, how can we, in planning to restore the monumental mosque and improve the physical environment, how can we make sure that our interventions are actually what people want? And I think the participatory process is a very important one. One thing that it does is it clarifies that collectively people might have a vision for improvement, but when you talk to them individually, you might find that they don't always, that people sometimes think of themselves. And the participatory process is partially about getting people to see the other point of view, to think, well, rather than only thinking of myself and my own interest, me, the owner of the cafe, how can I also think about my neighbor and what they're going to get out of it? One key thing about our work in Darb al-Ahmar, and I think it's true of the Historic Cities program in general, is that it operates by immersing itself in the local community. And it's not the kind of organization that flies in for 2 days, makes a quick assessment and goes away. And that is key to any improvement in an urban environment needs to be embedded in an understanding of not only the physical environment and its buildings, but the people, their needs, their wants, their aspirations. And in one small example, planning this square, we found that actually there were certain ways in which people used it. For example, because there was a cafe that had workers from outside the area sitting at it, women living in the neighborhood would walk as far as possible from the cafe because they didn't want people to see them in their kind of so-called home clothes. And so sometimes I mean, I think the most successful physical interventions or interventions that take into account the social aspect of how people live and how they want to live. And we found that in understanding Darb al-Ahmar, we found that actually there was this zone of people feeling comfortable going out in their home clothes, and a zone beyond that where it was seen as the public realm where you had to kind of look presentable. Another thing we found was that despite the long tradition of craftsmanship and craft workshops, for many of the young people in general, they weren't going to be craftsmen. They were university educated people with aspirations for professional jobs. And we sought to address that as well by introducing the opportunity to take, to learn Microsoft Word, to use, the latest computer packages, accounting, etc. And I think with historic urban environments, historic environments in general, it's important to realize that we can't live in the past. We can preserve the past, and it's very important. But we also have to think about our communities today. One of the best things about our project, I think, was that many of our colleagues and many of the people that worked on the project were from the area of Darb al-Ahmar. It gave them great opportunity to invest in improving their own environment, to shape the vision for its improvement, and to be active participants rather than recipients of someone else's vision. As you may well know from previous presentations, the Historic City Support Program, the Aga Khan Development Network, is not a government organization. And in intervening and in working in a historic environment, you can't do it without government partnership. And partnerships are key, I would say, not just the government, others as well. But for sure, we couldn't have done any of this had we worked in isolation. And I think in reflecting upon it, working in partnership with the government is the only way to create this complementarity between the technical specialists or maybe the social specialists and municipal authorities who are responsible for governance, infrastructure, all sorts of other things. I just chose this image to show you because this was the old planning, the old plan for historic Cairo from the 1960s, which had never been cancelled. It was still on the books, and all these roads were planned to cut through the historic city and through the site where we were planning Al Azhar Park. And one of the problems that local residents had is that they couldn't really restore their houses if they fell within any of these lines. It took our partnership work with the government to cancel this old plan, which didn't see the value in the urban fabric. And I think that's true of many historic cities in the past. They've always recognized monuments, but not really cared about the fact that what makes a city is not its monuments, but its everyday buildings, its streets, its markets, and its people. So working with the government, we managed to impress that vision. And I think that it's a vision and outlook that people now recognize, but they didn't recognize 20 years ago when we started working. And this is one example where, thanks to this scheme to put wide roads in the historic urban environment, a number of historic buildings were just cut through with a bulldozer. So that was what we were trying to stop. We undertook monument restoration work, of course, but part of the reason we did that and part of the choice in what buildings were to restore were the buildings that were important to the community, mosques and other spaces, which also provided us with the space to introduce health centers and community centers and literacy classes and things that the community identified as being important. And of course, the good thing about the restoration of historic buildings is that you can use them as an opportunity to create specialized jobs, especially if you train people from the local environment. I think any good urban conservation plan, any good intervention in a historic environment or a non-historic environment is based on a thorough understanding. And because our office was in the neighborhood, because, as I mentioned, many of the people working on team came from the neighborhood, and people from the neighborhood would approach us. We were walking the street the whole time. We became part of the community, and the community became part of us. And I think that if there's one lesson to be learned from our project, I think that would be it, to me. The other thing I think is that we didn't just limit ourselves to the dry economic development and finance and infrastructure. We also thought about, well, what do poor historic environments lack in terms of facilities, leisure facilities, amenities for their communities? And I think if you look at the range of things that the Historic City Support Program does, many of them are about improving the quality of life, which includes activities that we enjoy and young people enjoy and that bring us together to have fun. One of our most significant interventions was a housing rehabilitation program. The slide on top shows you the poorest houses which were overlooking the then crumbling city wall, which looks in a horrific condition. The image below is not a photoshopped image. It's actually the same houses after we restored them. And I think people themselves were very surprised by what was possible. The government had always thought that this area was beyond hope. And we convinced them, we said, well, give us one alley and we'll show you that actually we can restore the monuments, we can restore the houses with people living on them, on the monuments and in the houses, and that this area isn't as dreadful as you think it is. It took much persistence and persuasion, but eventually we did it. And when we first started working in the early 90s, even the local residents never believed us when we said, oh, we're creating a park, we're going to restore your houses. They all thought we were coming to demolish the area and we're going to relocate them. And they often told us, oh, just tell us the truth, we won't be upset, but at least it will stop us fixing our bathroom if we know that you're going to move us somewhere else. And so it's only when we actually started doing work that government authorities realized that actually we weren't dreaming. Local residents also realized that we were true to what we had promised them. And whenever we walked in the streets of Darb al-Ahmar after that, whenever I walked home or went to work, invariably 5 or 10 people would stop me and say, oh, excuse me, engineer, when are you going to come and restore my house? Which I should say was a scheme that people actually participated financially in doing this. They took a loan from us and we subsidized some things, but actually they were contributors to the scheme of housing rehabilitation. And I think this vision or this idea that people aren't going to invest, that they don't care, that because they're poor, they have no ambition, I think that's definitely untrue. Everyone wants a better environment, and in environments like this, like historic environments, most people have been there for generations, it's their home. They may not have had the tools to invest or to think about how to restore a falling wall, but they definitely want to do it, and with assistance, with guidance, with technical support, with government support, they're usually very happy, and there's a strong sense of neighborhood, a strong network, and most people like the areas in which they live, even if they want them to be better. And one thing we found, which was very encouraging, is that when we restored people's houses, we found that they took great interest and they started restoring the furniture and buying new curtains, and it was almost suddenly they were awakened to the potential of the historic environment, which had just gradually declined. So it was very encouraging, I think, to see how it set in motion a complete change in attitude and an optimism that probably hadn't existed for 30 or 40 years. Here are some images of the outcome. I mentioned the creation of a public park at the beginning of my presentation. You can see some of the bougainvillea in the right of the slide. It's truly one of the most beautiful sites in Cairo. People love the park. The people that overlook the dump site love overlooking a beautiful site rather than the dump site. And initially, there was some skepticism. Why are you investing your money in a public park? Surely there are more pressing things to do. But actually, once we created the park, which is used by hundreds of thousands of people every year, no one's ever questioned that since then. People see what a great public space it is, what a great facility it is to have, and how improving in public assets is really a very, very valuable thing. And here are people enjoying the park. But I'll end with the one point that I made previously. I think that the strength of our program was the empowerment of people from the local community. I chose, by looking on the internet and LinkedIn, 2 of my colleagues from Darb al-Ahmar, where we worked, who are now some of the leading specialists in development and social and urban upgrading, thanks to the Darb al-Ahmar project that we all worked on together. I would say the same applies to the experience that I benefited to just by this really ambitious project. I should say that since then, and there have been other schemes to improve the historic city, including large investment from the government. And I think that one of the most encouraging things is that in general, there's been a much greater appreciation of the importance of bringing people and places together and not just thinking of tourists or not just thinking of historic buildings. We still have some challenges. This is a building that was built illicitly next to a historic mosque in the wake of the Arab Spring when there wasn't government control. And I think it emphasizes the fact that private and government initiatives have to work hand in hand, that the government's role is essential and it always will be. And on a positive note, if you look behind the 4 smiley people in the front of this image, are about 500 people. These 500 people are on a local-led tour of historic Cairo. And I think that one of the things that's happened in the past 10 years or so, partially because of the Arab Spring, but partially because of social media and other tools for communication, it's easy to engage with people and say, well, come and discover your heritage, come on a tour of historic Cairo. And it's really encouraging to find that young Egyptians today are more interested, spend more time there. Yes, of course, there'll always be challenges, and the work of an urban conservationist is never easy, and it never will be easy. But it's nice to see that that people are starting to see it as valuable.
I'm going to go straight into the subject matter, which is to, and I'll try and do this by saying that when under the AKTC education program we have events like this, it's always to see how we can go beyond the simple transmission of what is already there in terms of learning's knowledge. And so what new insights, what new ideas, what new knowledge can help enrich this particular program, but also all conservation efforts. And so what I'm going to do is start by asking each of you what you would recommend to improve the way we go about urban rehabilitation in this particular mode, in this particular pattern. And I'll start with you, Yasminji, if I may.
For all of us, because normally when we work on historical cities, we think more about the buildings and the monuments. It is very encouraging, and I think that we should actually use it as an example for doing further work. But I have a few questions to ask you. Is AKTC opening up education program in Pakistan?
Yes, it's not a specifically Pakistan-focused education program as such. It's universal. Wherever there's an interest in the work of these 2 programs, but clearly there is plenty of scope to work with educational institutions in Pakistan, and we would very much like to do that. So yes.
Yes, think that we were opening up a program, but that has been shelved. Another question.
A little closer, the mic a little closer.
Yours was a fascinating presentation, but I think you forgot to put Pakistan on the map. It was black. Why?
Okay. Because I knew the whole afternoon session would be Pakistan focused, and then my colleague Masood Khan was following me, so I wanted to make kind of a general overview of why conservation and cultural heritage is important.
Well, I'm going to ask Arif Hassan to come in there, because I've known you for many years, sir, and you always have new ideas to share with us.
I think the old ideas have not really reached their climax. But anyway, in my experience of things, and more recently of working with hawkers especially, I find that people in general have an immense love and affection for their neighborhoods, for their past. And contrary to what is normally believed, especially I was very impressed by this presentation that was made, the last one, they are willing to invest in it, both financially and in maintaining what they invest in. What is missing is an affordable intervention, something that they can afford. And I think that is where the ingenuity and innovation of professionals comes in. Also, I feel that change in settlements, human settlements, and in the evolution of human knowledge and resources has to be looked at incrementally. I think this is one thing that is missing. We think that we can make an intervention, we can just push things through and it's done. Well, it's not done. It's a slow process, and it takes perhaps 2 generations for it to consolidate. And unless we can plan this incremental development, most development takes place and then dies. And I'd like to add here that this immense desire for communities, for people to change for the better, both their neighborhoods and themselves, is something that professionals generally don't recognize. They feel that they have to give something when there is already something there. It's already there. It just has to be spoken to. It just has to be dialogued. So I think research, social research, the changing nature of people, of culture also changes. It's not a static thing. Relations within communities change. And to understand that, and within communities, and the community's relationship with the rest of the world, I think these are things that have to be understood. And understood perhaps sympathetically. That is very important, and that has to be a part of academic education. Education is a bad word, I think, to use over here. It has to be a part of academic interaction with the world around it, which is usually missing.
Thank you very much, Arif, for those insights that need to be pondered very carefully, and particularly the point about time there's a philosophy within the AKDN that nothing that we do is in the short term. You need to give time to time. I'm going to turn now to you, Gulzarji, to ask you to address this question of what new ideas we might bring to the table.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I was very struck by first the introduction by Professor Isar and endorse just about everything that he introduced in the program. I'm familiar with this program almost since it began at Harvard, MIT, and before that. There are 2-3 things which are very personal to my own experience. My own training was not into conservation at all. I was a good student in history of architecture, but I also had an engineering background. Let me first confess that I'm a bit awed by the pure scientific and technical side of conservation. And I know Masood well enough, and I know his work, and I think it needs extreme patience. And that kind of patience does not come in mid-career. That patience should be somehow inculcated at the time when young people are in the universities, and the universities have programs. Of all the universities that I have worked at in Canada and in Pakistan, now only one university, the interest in history and conservation and culture and its identity impact that was really very well stated by Shiraz Ali Bhai. I think it's extremely well presented as to what happens to people when they lose contact with their own past, and where did they come from, what did they produce, and now what condition they are in. I'll give you one example. I came back to Pakistan after 44 years of being away, more or less academically or intellectually or as a student. I still have not recovered from what was done to the precinct of one of the holiest shrines in Lahore, that is the Data Sahab's precinct. I saw something that absolutely did not belong, and it was a general president who decided to have a competition, and then he himself became the jury member, I'm told. And now we have a thing that has in fact a major disturbance. And now that thing has been surrounded by bus routes. I was looking forward to hear about these rapid transit things today by Atiq, but we'll do it some other time. But we suffer it on a daily basis. So I think that heritage is very much an issue of consilience, which is one of my favorite wonderful little book on biology, usually given to first-year students at Harvard. I think the professor is now retired, Professor Wilson, I hope he's still alive. He has written another book called Darwin's Bridge, and he's looking for consilience even beyond biology. And I think that this business of heritage and heritage conservation is very much the need of the time. And I think that's what will probably bring a lot of additional peace in mankind. And a country like Pakistan, I think, which is suffering right now after a very successful change of government, back again to all kinds of misreadings and misunderstandings of various groups within the country. So I think heritage, in my mind, at this particular stage, is very much beyond its very refined technical challenges. It's a philosophical issue. And I think the best way to deal with them is not at beyond middle age, is to deal with when they're students, is to teach them what it is to remember. I heard these words way back, and I thank the source of these ideas. 3 words: life is to remember, life is to reflect on the memories, and the third one is to have a vision on the basis of the memories and the reflections upon the memories. And I think I can tell you about Lahore right now, that our reflections on the memories are very confused because other than very excellent maps of the walled city of Lahore, we know the reality of the walled city of Lahore, that it is slowly... For example, the Shahalmi area has still not been paid attention to, and it's one of the most dangerous areas in terms of the safety of after the Great Fire in 1947. So I think I am thrilled by every, kind of successful projects that we have seen. I have had other experiences. We spent 10 years, little by little, to fully document the marble floor of Sultan Hassan floor in Cairo. And it was by one single sentence that I heard from Hassan Fatih, directly from him, sharing a seat with him. I was lucky enough to be at that Aga Khan seminar in Jordan, and we were taken to Petra. And Hassan Bey, I asked him about Sultan Hassan floor because I was attracted by the geometry. It's one of my interests. And he said, he didn't know me. He just said, young man, I was young at that time. He said, young man, there are secrets in that floor. And that sentence struck me. And I said, what kind of secrets? He said, there are rivers of paradise in there. And so myself and 5 of my students, we measured that floor. It's published now in Nexus Journal, which is and now it's in a book. So that's the kind of interest that I have. I love to see the kind of work that Masood does. And Madam, sitting here, I have to also use this opportunity to acknowledge that she brought me back to Pakistan. I gladly came. She had an organization called CRC that was in fact dedicated to everything that I heard today. And Arif Hassan has been great support, always inspiring me and correcting me actually. Before that, I think I was lost very deliciously into about too many subjects, too many things. But I think this has brought me back to my own focus. And I really appreciate what is being done. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gulzarji. Those are wise thoughts. They're nuggets to ponder over. Thank you very much, Masood-ji and Gulzar Saab, Yasmeen-ji, Arif-ji, Shiraz-ji, for all of your excellent contributions to this panel. Our time is up, I'm afraid, and of course I shouldn't forget Saif, who is still listening, and you're now very, very being projected very large on the whole of the screen, Saif. So thank you very much for having been with us for this whole morning. Again, a pity that you couldn't join us in person, but that'll be for another occasion. So thank you, everybody, and we will break for lunch.